Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Millennial in the Middle. I'm Connor Dehlin, episode 25. We just keep hitting benchmarks. Kind of fun. Thanks for still listening. I know we're putting out a lot of content, and I see all the analytics from our listeners, and from the analytics, I'm not putting out too much. You're listening to it all, so thank you. As always, thanks for sharing and passing this on. We love seeing this movement grow, and so thanks for being a part of it. Today's interview, the last couple episodes that you've seen that have been the solo podcast with just me have been my reactions to the debates. The first presidential debate, a couple episodes, and then in episode 24, my reaction to the VP debate actually being there. Pretty cool experience. Got a lot of great feedback from you of thinking that was pretty cool to hear kind of the behind the scenes and what that was like. And so being in this mindset of debates, I thought I'd give you another little glimpse of my life that I haven't really talked about. In high school, I was on the debate team. I loved it. I was able, with debate, to really travel all over the country. Went to nationals a few years in a row. Debated at Stanford and Berkeley. I competed in an event called Lincoln Douglas, which is a value-based debate that's actually named after the series of debates that happened between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas as they were competing in the Republican primary to be the Republican nominee before Lincoln ended up winning, and then obviously went on to win the election just prior to the Civil War. So who I'm going to introduce you today is Alli Martin, or as I knew her back then, Mrs. Martin. She is now Dr. Martin, but in the episode, you'll just hear me refer to her as Alli. Alli was my high school debate coach, and I wanted to bring her on today because I have always respected her perspective of the world, of politics, of human rights issues, and her ability to articulate that is something that I think is really inspiring. And so I brought her on today to talk about a couple things. First off, I wanted to show the lessons that I learned in high school debate that I still benefit from now. And I think that my listeners are kind of learning as we go through this process with Millennial in the Middle of how to look at both sides of an argument, how to have empathy, how to not personally, emotionally tie your side of the argument to whatever the issue is, that you don't have to make it personally about you, about how to understand who you're speaking to and how to really impact people, how to influence change. And I think a lot of that I learned in debate and still carry that with me today. But more importantly, the reason I wanted to bring Alli on is Alli is one of the more liberal people I know. And to be honest with you, she was really the first person in my formative years in high school that started to open my mind to different ways of thinking. I grew up with Republican parents. I'm from Utah. Obviously, most of the people I know, my grandparents, all think very conservative. And I remember being in high school and all of a sudden kind of changing some of the ways I think as I learned more, as I became more informed. I've talked about before how in 2008, right in the middle of my high school years, how I was really on the Obama train, that I was excited about him, that was something that, I really cared about and got involved with. And Alli played a big role in that. So what I ask her in this episode are, what are those topics or those issues to her that make her believe the way she does and do the things that she does? She's become an activist in the society and has done a lot of good out there. To give you just a little feel for her bio, I want to read a little bit of what she's doing right now. Dr. Alli Martin, she currently works as an assistant principal at Horizonte Instruction and Training Center in Salt Lake City, in the Salt Lake City School District. She earned her doctorate of educational leadership and policy from the University of Utah. And Alli serves as a member of the Board of Governors for the Human Rights Campaign and is a co-founding member of Friends, Allies, and Mentors of the LGBTQ community, shortened as FAM, F-A-M. Through her work with FAM, Alli regularly provides professional learning experiences to educators on issues of intersectionality and LGBTQ youth. And some of the experiences that she shares here in the classroom dealing with, really human rights. We talk about race. We talk about LGBTQ rights, obviously. And I think this conversation is really inspiring and informative. And I hope this serves as a really good example of a positive conversation that we can have about possibly testy or uncomfortable topics. And I hope you learn a thing or two by listening to this. Thanks to Alli for joining with me, and we'll hear from you soon. Okay, well, Alli Martin, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate you coming out. We have not seen each other in, I think we said 7 or 8 years, right?
Oh, at least, yeah.
Well, crazy. It's been fun to me just before the call started to kind of reconnect with you and talk a little about some experiences. And I'm really excited for this interview today to kind of explain, honestly, the role you played in my life and still today, how kind of those things that I think you taught me and what I learned at that point in my life has still made an impact today. So you were my high school debate coach.
Yes.
And, I think it's funny. A lot of people think, it's almost like you're a little embarrassed or something now to say, oh, I was in debate. Like this has this nerdy connotation, or, oh, you were one of the debate kids. I'm proud of it, right? Like I was a debater. I was a good debater. I loved it. And tell me, like, what makes you love, like, specifically high school debate so much?
Oh my gosh. I think it's kind of like the land of misfit toys. You get a little bit of everybody who doesn't fit in perfectly, and it creates its own community. I think there's almost like a camaraderie amongst debaters, like you run into people and you meet them later in life and you're like, I bet that person did debate. And they did. Like you can tell, because it requires that you are a thoughtful person, that you appreciate thinking and academics and critical thinking skills. But there's also a little bit of a sense of like you're willing to not fit in, to question things and to stand out a little bit, because that's a necessary part of debate. Is you always have to be willing to look at the other side. And sometimes that doesn't make you popular, but it definitely makes you, I think, a more thoughtful person.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Actually, in prep for this interview, I was just kind of reflecting on, like, there are definitely lessons I learned that just being involved in debate taught me that I still hold on to today. And one of the first ones that came to mind is what you just mentioned there. And what a lot of people may not know when it comes to debate is that you debate both sides. So like, there's different types of events in debate. You may have a topic for a month or even all the way up to a year, but you prepare, basically a topic goes out nationwide and you prepare a case for and against that on both sides. And you don't show up at an event and get to choose, I'm pro this, and so I'm just going to argue for this for the next 2 days at this event. You're forced to argue both sides of that argument and write cases for both sides of it. And I think that's such a good skill that I think the world is lacking a bit today.
Yeah, I agree. I think, there are times, I know you experience this, where they tell you what the topic is and you're like, well, I could never see the other side of that. Sure. And then within about a week, you're like, oh my gosh, like I didn't even think about all of the good points on the other side of this. And I think, it doesn't change who you are, or it doesn't change your values or your ethics, but I feel like it makes them more robust, because you're not easily swayed. You have considered the other side and you have looked at different perspectives.
Yeah, I think, and it's so funny. We look at our political world we're in today, and I think if you ask some people to, like, hey, go make the case for Donald Trump, their head would explode, right? Or, hey, you go make the case for Kamala Harris, or for Bernie Sanders, and it would be like, my brain would just literally stop working. And I think that's such an important piece for us to realize, like, hey, there's truth in all aspects, not just politics, on all sides, and that there's always a bit of middle ground. And I think, that's the whole point of this podcast, Millennial in the Middle, right? I think most of us find ourselves, even though we may lean one way or another, somewhere in a rational, common sense, somewhere in the middle, and kind of finding how to live in that world, right?
Yes, agreed.
Yeah. You know, the other thing I thought about is I was breaking down kind of the lessons I learned is the mindset of a claim, warrant, and an impact. You taught me those three words. For my listeners, give a little rundown of what those three things mean. I think we could all benefit by thinking a little bit that way.
Sure. It's been a while since I've taught this. Okay.
Me too. I was remembering it today. I'm like, I still remember what it is, but I'm going to let you teach it.
Okay. All right. I'll do my best. So essentially the idea is that, you have to have a complete argument, which includes a claim, warrant, and impact. That the claim is just usually like the argument, like the title of the argument, right? So your claim might be that we should limit immigration in the United States. That's just a claim. You have no rationale behind that. So then you have to have your warrant, which is the rationale behind that. We should limit immigration in the United States because, and then you give some sort of a reason that's hopefully based in logic and possibly even better, supported by evidence, right? Yeah. And then even then, you're still not complete because after you've said what you want to do, why you want to do it, then you still have to say how what you just said impacts the world, right? So we should limit immigration because the United States economy is not strong enough to support new people coming to the nation or whatever.
Sure.
And therefore, we need to have fewer people in our country. That would be your impact. And then you still have to say, like, even just because you made a complete argument doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's just the starting point.
Yeah. And there's good arguments on both sides that have the claim, the warrant, the impact. I mean, I always remember thinking of it as, the claim is what I'm saying. The warrant is my reasoning behind it. It's my evidence. It's why I feel that's true. And then ultimately why it matters. And I think that impact piece is where I feel like a lot of us miss the point too, where we get so, muddled up in the details or these little policies and things like this. And then we take a little step back and be like, well, why does this make a difference? Why do we care about this? Why are we debating this in the first place? Does that does that have a big impact on my life, on the lives of others? And, just because it doesn't affect me doesn't mean it's not something we should talk about. And so I love that mindset. I think for all our listeners, as we go through this, the more, we hear these different types of arguments or debate, right? And we can think, are those pieces there? And specifically, as you can connect that to you, it makes us more intellectual, more informed as we go through this. Anything else you want to add to the value of debate before we jump into this?
Yeah, just very briefly, I do think, one of the things is that it forces you to respect your opponent. And part of having a well-constructed argument and listening to a well-constructed argument is it prevents us from getting into these really like name-calling-esque arguments that we hear so often now. So somebody said, like, I think we should limit immigration. And then the response was just like, why? Because you're a racist? Oh, you're a racist. It's like, wait a second, listen to why they say that. Listen to the whole argument and then respond to that, because you're going to be more persuasive for one thing, but also like, don't assume that just because you disagree with somebody that they don't have a reason or a well thought out, position for what they're saying. If we listen, then we can have better conversation and we can actually maybe come to a place of agreement.
I love that. And I know you've listened, but that's rule one of this whole podcast, right? The podcast rules is one, don't call names. Like the minute you do that, you lose credibility. And then we're not thinking through things. We're labeling people, we're shutting it off. And I even try to avoid on this, like, oh, that person's a Republican, that person's a Democrat. Because if that's what starts that conversation, I automatically think either more of them or less of them because, oh, they must agree with me or they're like me or they're unlike me. And, I think we saw a good example of this in the VP debate this week. We chatted about this a little bit this week. Obviously, the contrast between what happened in the VP debate was, miles apart from what happened in the week before. But one thing I said going into that was I really hoped for a good debate, I think, like we saw, because I think the two parties' platforms really are very different right now. Very different directions they feel the country will head. And honestly, I think a good debate is if you talk to people, oh, who won that debate? I think whoever side you agree with, you probably feel won the other night because they both did a pretty good job of making their case for why they feel the way they do. Obviously, different bumps along the way and flies on the head, and that's what we talk about. But, what was from a debate mindset, what were your thoughts on what we saw this week?
Yeah, I agree with you. It was definitely a better debate than the presidential one, for sure. I'm always disappointed in these debates because it's not really debate. It's competing talking points, which is disappointing, but I also understand it makes for better television. Sure. But I do think, there were points that I wish had been pressed. I wish that instead of just trying to cover everything, they would just go really deep into one or two areas. Yeah. Because there were questions I had that I wish had gotten answered, but at the same time, I do feel like I came away with a better understanding of where each candidate, or not just where they stand, but why they stand. What they believe is informing them. So that was helpful.
Yeah. No, it was interesting because the kind of the last thing that I learned from this whole mindset of debate was the concept of judge adaptation. Right. And it's this thought that, hey, in high school debate, there's one judge or sometimes a panel of judges, if that you're going to, go with a majority vote, that decides who's the winner. And you learn very quickly that you need to get to know your judge a little bit or have a feel for what they might be thinking or the way they think through things before you go in. If you approach every topic the same way all the time, you might miss the boat with certain voters. And that's kind of hard when you're talking to 100 million people. It is.
And I think, a lot of people criticize that they're both candidates are too far in the middle, right? I mean, not as much in this campaign, but a lot of times they say, Biden's not liberal enough, Trump's, or I don't know if there's anybody arguing that he's not conservative enough, but in the past, I've heard that.
Yes. We heard that with Romney. We'll say that.
There you go. Yeah. And I think that, part of that is that judge adaptation, like they're not going to come out extremes because they're looking to try to be persuasive to the most number of people. And when you really look at it, like extremes don't get us too far. I mean, there are a lot of very liberal causes that I believe in, but I don't think that me shouting down another person is going to help those causes. It has to be a conversation. And in order to start that conversation, like you've said so many times, you have to start in the middle.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great segue into the whole thought of what I want to talk about today, because frankly, I grew up in Utah. My parents are conservative. My grandparents are conservative. Most of my friends, the people I'm around, like that's just what I grew up thinking and around. And in high school, all of a sudden I'm in debate. And I remember you were legitimately like the first person I remember talking politics with that was very liberal on most topics, right? And being like, oh, well, Mrs. Martin, I'm going to say Mrs. Martin here, not Alli, right? But Mrs. Martin is really smart. She's right. She makes a lot of good points here. And, in 2008, I graduated high school in 2010. So right in the middle of that was Obama's campaign. I was on the Obama bandwagon, right? Like he was speaking to the youth, change we can believe in compared to this McCain guy that looks like a dinosaur. Like that spoke to me. And I, really appreciate all of a sudden, that's when I started to open my mind to, some different ways of thinking. And I want to give a little bit of a challenge today to our listeners as we talk about this. To my listeners out there that fall more on the conservative side, don't just take that like temptation of just shutting this conversation off, because I want to talk today, Alli, about what you feel are the voting issues of just kind of like liberal mentality or the Democratic Party in general right now. I don't necessarily want to talk about why you should vote for Joe Biden or why you shouldn't vote for Donald Trump. Like, I think we know that both these mindsets are way bigger than two people. Mm-hmm. But for you, like talking voting issues, what do you feel like stands at the forefront of the most important things you look at today?
So for me, I'm very involved in advocacy work for the LGBTQ community. So for me, I go there first, and one of the reasons why it's always been really dear to my heart it comes from being a high school teacher. So my very first year teaching high school, I remember I had a student who was gay. He was struggling to come out of the closet. He was struggling to kind of, be okay with who he was. And debate, as we said, it was kind of a safe place for him. And I remember I took a sick day, and I, came back the next day, and every teacher who's ever had a sick day, who's ever had to have a substitute teacher knows that fear of like, what went wrong while I was gone? How did the sub change everything? And the students were all complaining about the sub, and I was like, okay, I know everybody has these complaints, but I found out that the student had come into my classroom to bring an assignment in or something. He'd stop by and he wasn't even in the class or something like that day. And the sub made fun of him and talked about how he was so gay, and how if he had a son like that, he'd disown him or something just really horrible like that. And
not to his face, but to the other students?
To the rest of the class, right?
Oh,
after
wow.
this kid had left. And my students were up in arms, and they were so mad, and for good reason. And I just remember thinking wow, I've created this safe space, where kids feel comfortable and where kids feel like they can be themselves and that they are welcome. But the second I leave the room, that leaves. And I can't even protect my own classroom when I'm not there. And that was, for me, kind of one of the pushing points to get me more involved in advocating for larger change. And this was, 2001. So this was a while ago when I started teaching. And I think things have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And the more and more informed I got on it, the more I came to realize that, this fear that my student had, and since then I've had lots of gay students, because there are lots of gay people in the world.
Sure.
And that these fears are very legitimate, because at any given time, you don't know how somebody's going to react to you and how somebody's going to treat you. And so for me, a big issue is the way that our federal government can protect LGBTQ people and ensure that they don't have to live their lives in fear as much as they do now. And even with things like repealing, the Human Health and Housing Services Department has turned back some regulations saying that now homeless shelters can discriminate against transgender people. So we know transgender people are more likely to be homeless because they're more likely to be jobless, and they're more likely to be kicked out of their homes. And so then to say that because you're a transgender man or a transgender woman, you can't have the services of a homeless shelter, puts people in a really dangerous position. And it makes them less likely to ask for help, because now they can, again, legally be discriminated against.
Yeah.
And so for me, those are the issues. Do we want to be the kind of country where everybody feels welcome and accepted, or do we want to be the kind of country where certain people are excluded legally, which is, not the kind of world that I want to live in?
Yeah. Now, that's a really powerful story. And I think everyone listening to that is probably just cringing as you hear that, right? It's probably not I don't think that's that extreme or unusual of a story, right? Things like that happen more often than we'd probably want to admit. And here's what I think a lot of people struggle with in politics, right? Is what you just described right there, I think would be labeled as a liberal or democratic belief or platform, right? But why? I sit there and look at that. I had a viewer or a listener very early on send me a message that it was so simple, but I thought it was so well done, where she said, Connor, I love the idea of this podcast because I am a conservative. I vote for Republicans, I'm Republican, but the thing I care the very most about is the environment and protecting our environment. And she's like, so I'm very liberal there, but almost everything else I fall very conservative. And she's like, I hate that I can't care about the environment and be a Republican at the same time. And I think like this is a similar argument of why, if we're forced to pick a side, like, are you for gay rights or against gay rights? That's not a decision that anyone wants to make. And hopefully that's a pretty easy decision, because it's not gay rights, it's human rights. And protecting those around you, especially that are in the minority in any sort of situation. What are your thoughts on, like, how can a conservative try to like deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it is if you've never stood in somebody else's shoes, it's hard to see where they're coming from. I'm surprised how many people come to me as the parent of a gay kid, or as they find out that they have a family member, somebody they love who's part of the LGBTQ community, and then all of a sudden they're changing and they're saying like, wow, I didn't realize. And so I think part of it is just starting to assume you've got somebody you love who's part of this community. Does that change how you feel and how you might vote? And if so, maybe think about like, how is it okay to vote or to advocate for the things that you are advocating for now, if it would change if you knew somebody who was part of it, that it would affect them more individually. I think that's part of it. I think it's really easy for people like you and me to not know about it. We don't have to know. Yeah. I don't have to know that in 26 states, I could be denied a hotel room if I tried to check in as a lesbian with another woman. I don't have, that's not a concern that I've ever had before, but now that I know that doesn't feel right to me. And that seems like something that, business shouldn't be able to deny housing to somebody just because they're gay in a country where gay marriage is legal.
Yeah.
So I think, the more we're informed, the more we can make better choices.
For sure. I had another listener that came to me, and it was funny because I actually had 2 back-to-back episodes early on. Episode 4 was about immigration and basically very talking about the complexities and how this is something that we need to open our minds to and be more willing to accept. And I'm very liberal, in air quotes, for people, those of you that are listening, when it comes to, immigration. But but then the very next episode, I talked about Donald Trump. I talked about why the polls got it wrong. And I said, hey, I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Here's why. Here's what my thinking was. And someone said, well, Connor, I think that's hard for you to make that point because like immigration at the end of the day doesn't affect you. So it's easy not to vote on it. But the economy or foreign policy, the military, things like that, you feel have more an effect on your life. So you go vote for what is really going to affect you. And I think she's right. Like, I didn't have a great answer for her there because, of course, like, we are going to prioritize things that affect our lives more than anything else. But we have to balance that. We have to still protect those people that may not be in the same boat we are.
Yes. So I told you that I wanted to tell the story about my dad, and
please do. I'd love to hear it.
So this informs a lot of kind of how I think about this. So my dad was born in 1942. He was born in the U.S., but to immigrant parents from Italy. So grew up very poor in the South in Louisiana, and attended Catholic school, as most Italian Americans do. But incredibly poor. He ended up being a very good athlete. He got a scholarship to LSU, Louisiana State University, on a full ride scholarship for track and basketball. He was the first person in his family to go to college. He was the first person to graduate from college. He became a high school math teacher and a basketball coach. He actually organized the first integrated basketball game in Louisiana. So he had his white basketball team do a scrimmage match against the black basketball team. and
Wow.
had a cross burned on his lawn as a result of that. He got a master's degree, and then he ended up getting 2 doctorate degrees, and he's now a college professor. And so by a lot of accounts, it's like a really great story of like an immigrant who worked super hard, or like the child of an immigrant, who worked super hard, raised himself up by his bootstraps, fought for civil rights, fought for racial equality. And because of him, I was able to live a much better life. I grew up without having to worry about if there would be food on the table or if I'd be able to go to college. And then, because he's a college professor, I got half off my tuition, which made my college experience a little bit easier. I ended up getting my master's and a doctorate degree as well. And, part of that is because I had a dad who set that example for me.
Yeah.
So it's a good story, right?
For
but
sure.
Then you have to like scratch a little bit under the surface. And that's where my thought kind of changed, because my dad did work really hard, and he was smart, he was hardworking, and he did accomplish a lot that other people weren't able to accomplish. But he did have an advantage that a lot of other people don't have in this country, and that is that he got that full ride scholarship to LSU because he was an amazing athlete, but also because he didn't have to compete with African Americans. Every Black person in Louisiana was not allowed to go to LSU at that time. So my dad got to go on a basketball scholarship, and there were definitely talented Black men out there who were not able to do that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where, even though he worked hard, even though he dedicated himself to this, and he definitely earned it, he still had an advantage that he didn't earn, that allowed him to get where he was, which allowed me to get where I was, which, is allowing our family to prosper in this country. And so, I think it would be hard for anybody to say that my dad is a racist. He fought for civil rights, but he still benefited from a racist system. And that's a truth that we have to own. And I think as white people in this country, we have to accept the fact that we do benefit from our whiteness. And that's uncomfortable, and we didn't earn that, and we didn't want that. It doesn't make us bad people. But if we don't acknowledge that truth, then we kind of lose out on the understanding of why racism is still an issue in this country and why we should still be concerned with it. So when you say things like, I don't have to care about immigration because it doesn't affect me personally, like that's because at one point in time it did affect you personally. Do you know what I mean? Like in your history. Yeah. And so then owning that and saying like, okay, it is my issue now. Now it is my issue, and it is something that I do have to care about. I think is a way that we can start to build some empathy, and it doesn't make you more or less conservative or liberal or whatever. It just makes you understand history a little bit better and understand the interrelationships in our country a little bit better, because those people aren't those people anymore. They're my people.
I think that is so cool to hear that story told in that way. I mean, one, that's a really inspirational story. How cool is that he put together the first, integrated basketball game in Louisiana in that time period. But I think how you told that story at first is how we would typically tell that. This is a success story. This is an immigrant that came and worked hard, and his hard work was rewarded, and that's now been passed down onto generations. But I think you just walking us through the kind of next level as we get under the surface, like you said, to that story is eye-opening. And I want to ask you a question, because my thought that I had as you were going through that is, you said that we're a part of or we've at least benefited from a racist system, which there's no doubt that as white people in America, we have been privileged. Like, I think that phrase, white privilege, scares people, but no, like, we're privileged. I'm a very privileged person. I wouldn't ever argue with anyone on that. Where I think conversations struggle on this topic is when that all of a sudden is taken to mean, whether it's intentional or not, of, well, does that mean I'm racist? and I'm not a racist, right? And then immediately when I get called a racist or think someone's calling me racist, what am I going to do? I'm going to get defensive and I'm going to tell you, no, I integrated the first basketball game and I was the guy that was holding that. I had a cross burned on my lawn. The last thing I am is racist, right? What are your thoughts on how we can handle that dichotomy?
Yeah, I love that you asked that, because I read a really interesting article years ago, and it gave me this line that really helped me. The author said, and I wish I could quote them, but I don't remember who wrote it. The author said that the only experience that a white person can have that is equivalent to a Black person being called the N-word is for a white person to be called a racist. And I thought that informed me a lot, because I feel like we spend, and I'm speaking for white people here, and I'm obviously not everybody, but we spend a large part of our energy on trying to avoid being called a racist. It's an incredibly uncomfortable feeling to think that somebody would think that about us. And it's also something that, we desperately don't want to be associated with, because it is a horrible part of our country's history. And unfortunately, a part of our country's present as well. So no, I don't think that you're a racist. I don't think that I'm a racist. I don't think my dad is a racist, even though he went to a segregated school. I think that we all live in a racist system, a system that was built on racism and that has elements of racism in it. And because we're part of that system, some of the racism that exists in it, we're blind to, because it's just, to us, normal. It's just what we see the world. And I remember talking to students at Alta High, which is at the time that I taught there, it was 97% white. Yeah. And we were talking about, is it weird that we're at a school that's 97% white? Isn't that segregation? And they were like, well, no, just Black people don't want to live here. Fine. And to a certain extent, that's a valid answer, but then you have to go deeper and say, well, why? Why don't they want to? What's preventing people from wanting to live in neighborhoods that are more diverse? Why do you feel more comfortable in a neighborhood where your neighbors are going to look like you? Why might other people feel that way? And we need to avoid saying that there's something wrong with just accepting a reality that we've been presented, and instead start to look at what is it about our reality that we want to change? Because it shouldn't be a judgment thing. It's not, nobody chose the color of skin that they were born in. Nobody chose the parents that they had, but we do get to choose the way in which we engage with the world. And we can only make our choices based on the information we have. So the more informed we become, the better we are at engaging with our world. And that's part of what we need to do to make this country a better place, I think. And it's also something that when we understand that, we can start to talk a little bit more intelligently. And instead of just saying everything's racist or everything is closed-minded or whatever, we can start actually talking about what's behind that. And, I can acknowledge that the privileges that I've had that I didn't earn, and then I can use the power that I have to help make sure that doors are open to people who they might not be open to traditionally.
I think that's a really good perspective. And that quote you just shared about, the equivalent of being called the N-word and the equivalent of being a racist, to me, why I think that really hits home is on both sides of the spectrum there, whatever you're called, it's emotionally charged, right? It's going to stir up those emotions in you. And I think that's one of the things that's difficult with our political discourse today is a lot of these topics we're discussing are very emotionally charged. And like you said, we need to look at this intellectually. Well, the minute a lot of emotion gets involved, intellect can go out the window and reason starts to go out the window, and conversations all of a sudden, we stop listening to each other and we're suddenly trying to defend rather than to listen, or more importantly, make progress and say, okay, well, what next? And how do we do this? And this isn't the cops versus black people, like this isn't a device. While it is divisive in the sense of, hey, it's emotional and we need to find answers to this, we shouldn't fall into that trap of picking a camp, getting emotional, and stating our case,
Yeah. I think I've always been surprised by like the response to when people say Black Lives Matter, that the knee-jerk reaction for some people is no, all lives matter, as though saying Black Lives Matter somehow denigrates the lives of other people. You can't have one without, and I think that's exactly it. Is like, can't I say that Black Lives Matter and still honor the fact that there are other lives there are other people who also have it hard. There are other experiences that are also difficult. And somehow it feels like everybody wants to center their struggle first as a way to defend themselves against being considered like biased, like, for other people. And that's the attitude that I feel really prevents us from having these good conversations. I have to be able to set my ego aside and say, it's not about me. It's not about what my experience is. I want to hear yours and I want to learn from you. And then that way I can be a better person. So when somebody says to me, Black Lives Matter, I say, yes, they do matter. And tell me more about your experience as a Black person or as a person of color. And that doesn't mean that you don't think that my life matters. That doesn't mean that you don't think somebody else's life matters, but I want to hear about why you feel the need to tell me that your life matters, because clearly you're not feeling that right now. And I think that if we could approach these topics with that kind of an attitude, the attitude of a listener and of a learner, then we would be able to hear each other, and it wouldn't be two sides chanting at each other, or worse. It would be two individuals talking.
Yeah. I had this analogy given to me once. I don't know if you've heard this. I kind of want to share this with my listeners about that all lives matter or Black Lives Matter mindset, where someone explained it this way. And I said, oh, that's brilliant. They said, it would be like if you went to a charity event or some like charity auction for breast cancer research. And everyone there was talking about breast cancer and what they had done and stories involving those that had been, that had had breast cancer, research that was being done, and people were donating to support that cause. And if the crowd at the end of the night started chanting, breast cancer matters, and someone at the back of the room started shouting, hey, well, all cancer matters. Leukemia is important too. Like, leukemia matters. And it's like, yes, leukemia does matter. Yes, all cancer matters, but that's not why we're here tonight. We're not here at this charity auction to talk about leukemia, even though leukemia is important. We're here to talk about breast cancer research and people that have been affected by that. And so if you come to this event, just listen and see what you can do to help that cause. And that doesn't make another cause less than. And to me, I think this like white lives matter, blue lives matter is just our society today doing exactly what you said, finding a chant finding a chant that's divisive, and neither side makes any progress. We just all fight and argue with each other.
Yeah. Audre Lorde, I can quote her. Audre Lorde said, we don't want a bigger slice of the pie. We want a different pie. And I think that, that same thing, like no one's taking away from somebody else by getting more rights for one group. It's not like there's a limited amount of pie out there. And if certain people get rights, then other people get less. And I mean, to follow your analogy too, like if we raise money for breast cancer, that doesn't hurt leukemia patients. And there's actually a possibility that whatever research is done for breast cancer might benefit other cancers as well, right? Mm-hmm. So there, if you see us all as interconnected, and if you see us all as part of the same system, then you realize that what benefits one will benefit somebody else as well. Yeah.
I think it's cool because this, frankly, you are one of the more liberal people I know, right? And I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, she's on extreme, she's there. But this conversation that we have had today is what the podcast is all about. about increasing empathy, is listening, is how to have conversations. And I think in closing, the last question I want to ask you is, we've talked about the importance of listening to each other. But beyond that, like specifically we focused today on, on race and on LGBTQ plus rights and those two issues in our world and country right now. What else can we do beyond just listening and trying to have empathy? Like, what is your advice to people that care about these topics but feel kind of helpless?
It's a really great question. I think I will say that one of the tougher steps that I took in my journey towards becoming more of an advocate is talking to other people. So I said a lot today that listening is really important, but then there's that next step of talking, and that's it's one thing to listen to people and to take it in and to change yourself, but then you have to go to somebody else, another person who looks like you, and tell them about it as well, which is really scary. And sometimes it feels really uncomfortable. The advice that inspired me in my work as an educator was, somebody in the room has to feel uncomfortable. Somebody in the room has to feel unsafe in order for any progress to be made. And isn't it better that the adult in the room be the one who feels uncomfortable and unsafe than like the 13-year-old child? So when I, work in my classroom to make it a safe, comfortable place for all of my students, that puts me in a position where I'm not always sure that everybody's going to be okay with that. And I'm not always sure that, a parent's not going to complain or a student's not going to challenge me on that. But I would rather be the person who takes the brunt of that criticism than to allow one of my students to speak up and say their truth and get attacked for it. Does that make sense? So it's almost, teachers have this history in our country of literally putting themselves in front of bullets for their students. We love our students. It's been years and years since I've seen or talked to you, but you are important to me, and you always will be because you were my student. And that's something that teachers do. And that's something that I think we need to develop that as a society for each other, right? That sense of like, I'm willing to have a really uncomfortable conversation with my neighbor or my sister-in-law or whoever, because I don't want a Black family in my neighborhood to feel uncomfortable living there. So now I'm going to be the one who's going to go forward and be uncomfortable for them. And that I think is something that we can do. And the other thing too is just to become more educated. There have been a lot of great book lists that have come out recently, reading. There are so many amazing TV shows out there to watch, just to be a little bit more comfortable in a space that we're not always walking in. And we're kind of stuck at home a lot more now. So reading and watching TV is a great way to experience worlds that maybe don't exist in our daily lives.
Yeah.
So I think it's an okay time to sit and just watch TV.
That will say that's the advice. We all need to watch more TV. Just stay off Fox News and MSNBC. Watch something else, right? So I think that's a great place to end, because there's that next step of, as we educate ourselves, and then that just becomes more of who we are, and that carries on. And I think we make influence in people's lives in more of a granular level. I think so often in the middle of a presidential election, for example, we think of all these big problems as it relates to the country, but often breaking it down to just, you've said several times, your neighbors, your community, those around you, and those are the people that you have a direct impact on their life. And I think as we are more empathetic, more informed, we are able to be better people as that happens. Lastly, thank you so much for being on. I loved when you said that about teachers, because teachers do play such an incredible role in all of our lives. And, a big thank you to, I know I have lots of teachers that listen. Actually, I've got one teacher in particular that like twice a week says, you should talk about this, you should do this. And I love it, because it's that mentality of a teacher would love a conversation like this. and hopefully we're able to create a whole lot more of it. And here we are 10 years later, and we started this call with the things that I remember you teaching me, and that still stuck. And hopefully that's become a little part of me. So thank you for that. Thanks for coming on. I end every episode the same way, but Alli made it very clear that she will be just joining in a silent manner here. So, clowns to the left me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. See you next time, everybody.